It is 5 o'clock in Vancouver, 6 p.m. in Saskatoon, and 9 o'clock in Charlottetown. This is Canada Tonight. We'll bring you the latest from this evening's closing arguments in Donald Trump's historic hush money criminal trial. In a moment, you'll hear from a former U.S. federal prosecutor about the case and what's next in the trial. Plus, how to protect yourself this tick season. I'll speak with our medical contributor, Dr. Samir Gupta, about that. And a little later on, the moment an Ontario MPP made history today, addressing the legislature in his own Indigenous language. But first, closing arguments have now wrapped up in Donald Trump's criminal hush money trial. The former president's defense team made their final pitch to jurors, trying to undermine the credibility of the prosecution's star witness, Michael Cohen. Chris Reyes takes us through how the day unfolded.
Donald Trump arrived at the courthouse for the final stretch of his historic trial. Before going into the courtroom, Trump spoke to cameras. As he has done for the last 5 weeks, he railed against the case and proclaimed his innocence.
There's nothing wrong. This is everybody saying it, except we have a judge who's corrupt.
With closing arguments, lawyers on both sides get their final chance to address the jury. On social media, Trump called it unfair that the defense had to go first, how it's done in the state of New York.
The defense never gets to go last. The defense does not have the burden of proof.
Trump's lead attorney, Todd Blanche, spent almost 3 hours attacking the prosecution's case, focusing mostly on Michael Cohen's testimony that his former boss directed him to pay off the adult film star Stormy Daniels, concerned about the story getting out ahead of the 2016 presidential election, and that payment was later covered up in Trump's business records, the basis of the prosecution's case. Blanche called Cohen a liar repeatedly. Outside the courthouse, Trump's children gave their own defense of their father.
He's an inspiration to me every single day, and he'll be vindicated.
Also speaking outside the courthouse, a group in support of President Biden, led by the actor Robert De Niro, who is the narrator of Biden's most recent campaign video.
I don't mean to scare you. No, wait, maybe I do mean to scare you. If Trump returns to the White House, you can kiss these freedoms goodbye.
Prosecutor Josh Steinglass told the jury that this is a case about a conspiracy to kill, damaging stories about Donald Trump ahead of the 2016 presidential election, including his alleged affair with Stormy Daniels, and then covering up the hush money payments to kill those stories for the purpose of hiding it from voters, something that he called overt election fraud. Now, after closing arguments, the jury will receive their instructions from the judge, and then they will get all the time they want to deliberate. And in order to convict or acquit, they'll have to come to a unanimous decision. If even one juror decides they can't make up their mind, it will be a hung jury. The entire nation holding their breath for that verdict. Chris Reyes, CBC News, New York.
All right, let's dig a little deeper into today's closing arguments with Joe Moreno. He is a former federal prosecutor, more importantly, a friend of the show, joining us from Alexandria, Virginia tonight. So, Joe, good to see you once again. Closing arguments have just wrapped up, which means the case is about to go to the jury. This was a long day. Is it normal to see these closing arguments stretch so late into the evening?
Travis, there's nothing normal about this entire case, and 10 hours is a long time to ask a jury to sit in a courtroom. Those are very long amounts of time that the defense and then the prosecution went on. 2.5 to 3 hours by the defense, that's already a pretty lengthy closing. 5 hours for the prosecution. That at some point you really run the risk of losing the jury's attention span and almost getting them annoyed. So obviously the prosecution felt, particularly after the jurors had the week off, that they really had to go back into a lot of detail and walk the jurors step by step through what they allege is this conspiracy by Donald Trump and others to interfere with the 2016 election. So I give the jury a lot of credit. It must not have been an easy day for them, and I'm sure they're glad it's behind them.
Yeah, absolutely. What stood out to you from today's closing arguments?
Well, the focus by both sides on Michael Cohen, I think it was expected. I mean, he's obviously, it reflects the fact that he's so important to the prosecution in this case. And so, not surprisingly, the defense spent a lot of their 3 hours just bashing him, saying to the jury again and again, you can't trust him. He's a convicted liar. He's a tax cheat. He's a disbarred attorney. Even when he was working for Donald Trump, he was surreptitiously recording their phone conversations. He's a guy that can't be trusted, and therefore you cannot reach belief beyond a reasonable doubt and convict this man based on the testimony of Michael Cohen. On the other side, the prosecution basically tried to say, look, we know Michael Cohen does not have a perfect reputation. We know his history is spotty. But the fact is that what he's saying is corroborated by other evidence, and therefore don't just take his word for it. Look at the case in its entirety, and therefore that should allow you to get to finding of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right, and so, which leads me to my next question here, because you mentioned it. You know, the prosecution really has to prove here, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Trump had the intent to defraud and order these payments. How hard is it for them to prove intent?
Travis, you put your finger right on it. I mean, that is the difficult part of this case. Intent means knowledge. It means that Donald Trump was aware that certain laws were out there that he had to comply with, and then intended to violate them, either directly or indirectly through others. And so that's what the prosecution, despite spending 5 hours in a closing statement, they could explain in like 5 minutes what they need to prove, which is that we have to show that Donald Trump intentionally violated campaign finance laws. And here's how he did it, and then go through that very sequentially. So it is not a difficult fact pattern, but it is a difficult legal concept. And so if the defense has a chance here, it's creating that reasonable doubt in the jury's mind that say, okay, the facts are what they are, but whether or not Donald Trump actually had that intent, and we as 12 people are confident in finding that he did beyond a reasonable doubt, that will probably be the difference between a conviction and either a hung jury or an acquittal. Now,
remind us here in Canada, because, obviously we're paying attention to this, but not as closely as, folks in the United States are. Is the jury sequestered in this case? Are they able to see media coverage, or do they not have access to any of that?
They have not been sequestered. So I think they go home. I mean, even the last 7 days, they've been home for Memorial Day weekend and the week prior. I think generally they're definitely instructed not to talk to anybody about the case. They're generally instructed not to look at media, not to engage in conversations or look at outside sources, but it's not really enforced. So at the end of the day, they go home, they speak to their families, and there's no way to actually stop them from picking up a newspaper or watching television.
So, does that factor in here as well, the media circus that has been this trial so far?
It's not supposed to, but then again, how could it not, right? I mean, these 12 people out of the 4 billion people in this world are sitting through this very unique experience, and they must be thinking not only about the trial itself and how they'll ultimately rule, but what are the consequences afterward? I mean, are they going to sort of ever talk about this? Will there be any kind of danger to them? Will they feel like they have some kind of a larger role in determining this case? And so I have to think that in a perfect world, a juror would only look at the facts and the law. But in reality, people have to think, I'm involved in something so historic. There's got to be more than just what's in front of me right now. That's human nature, right?
The jury has had a lot of information that has been presented to them. How long do you, and this is kind of an unfair question, but how long do you anticipate that they could possibly deliberate for? Or do you think that they'll come back pretty quickly here?
I would say days, not weeks. So what will happen is now the closing arguments are wrapped up. First thing tomorrow morning, Judge Merchan will give what's called the jury instructions. And that's basically the judges walking them through what they need in order to reach a finding of guilt or not guilty. Those instructions were negotiated last week. So once just reading them to the jury won't take very long, maybe an hour. Then you set them on their way and they sit in a jury room for however number of days it takes to reach a unanimous decision. My guess is we will get a vote before the weekend. So my guess is they'll take Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and by the end of Friday, we'll probably know what they're going to decide.
Guilty, not guilty, those are options here. Could we also see a mistrial in this case, or a hung jury, or do you not expect that?
Actually, I think it's a very good likelihood of that. I think that because of the complexity of the legalities of this case, and the fact that a case like this has never been brought in New York State, and so I could absolutely see at least one juror just saying, you know what, I'm not comfortable with this. I'm not comfortable with this lengthy explanation of this legal theory that doesn't often make a lot of sense. And so I don't think it would take much, just one person to hold out. And then you have a hung jury, right? Then you have a mistrial, which means that it goes back to the state, and the state decides whether to try it again or to drop it. And I think that would be a huge victory for Donald Trump, either that or a full acquittal. But no, I think a hung jury is a high likelihood in this case.
Last question here, and then I got to let you go because I'm over time. We've been talking about the historic nature of this case. What are the implications for this case and the outcome?
Well, legally, it's what's Donald Trump's sentence, right, if he's convicted? Fine, jail time, some kind of home confinement, right? Politically, of course, is how does it affect the election? Constitutionally, he can run, he can win, he can serve, even as a convicted felon. But of course, will this impact how voters rule for him? How voters decide to whether to reelect him or not? It's already a close election. I have to think if he's convicted, that might be the difference between a win and a loss for him.
We shall see. We'll see if it's a matter of days or weeks, like you say. Joe, appreciate it. We'll call on you again. That is Joe Moreno, a former federal prosecutor, joining us tonight from Alexandria, Virginia.